Hi, Louisa.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Anthony. We'll get started. So pleased that you could join us today. And I'm Louisa Mamuni. As host of this webinar, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of Aboriginal people, and I'm on Gadigal land. And I'd like to show my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. We're joined by Anthony Lean, who is the Secretary of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment, Water, and he oversees a diverse portfolio relating to the state's natural resources, environment and heritage, as well as leading the way on climate change, driving the sustainable transition to a net zero economy, and powering affordable, reliable and clean energy. He is a highly respected public sector leader with more than 20 years of senior executive experience across lots of portfolios and a track record of overseeing complex organisations and programs and strategic vision delivering results for the people of New South Wales. Most recently, Anthony was Deputy Chief Executive at the Law Society, and he has also held many roles in the public service in New South Wales, including as CEO of Office of Environment and Heritage, also State Insurance Regulatory Authority, and the former Department of Finance Services and Innovation. So welcome, Anthony, and great to have you with us today. I think you have some slides to
I do. Yeah.
share, and
I,
apparently I have an echo, but I'll work out how to fix that. But I'll hand over to you, Anthony.
okay. Look, thanks, Louisa, and can I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm on, which is Gadigal lands, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal people joining us today. I'll have a go at sharing my slides, which could be a bit of a challenge, but we'll see how we go. Is that coming through?
Yes, it's not in presenter mode, but we can cope with that probably.
If I do that. That working?
No. Yes, I think it's coming.
Great.
So it's just having a moment. Yes, we can see now.
Okay. Look, thank you very much for inviting me to present today. What I was going to do was do a bit of an overview of the climate change policy framework that is in place in the New South Wales government and provide a bit of a history of how we got to where we are today with that framework, but also talk about some of the key programs of work that we've got underway in a policy sense to help deal with the challenge of climate change. You know, it's certainly one of the most significant challenges facing New South Wales and the whole world, and it's something that takes up, you know, a very large part of my department's focus. And yeah, so I think but it's also increasingly taking on a whole of government focus as well, and that I think is something that's really useful to share with this group. Look, at the end as well, Louise has asked me to maybe give a couple of reflections on sort of my thoughts on good policy or what you need to do to succeed in government as a policy advisor. So I'll touch on that at the end. And we might have time for some questions as well. I think we've got an hour, haven't we, Louisa? So I'll try and talk for about 30 minutes, maybe a little more, and then we'll throw it open for questions. But we'll see how we go. So just on climate change, sorry, I need to work out how to adjust my slides. So New South Wales actually has a very long history in coming up with policy that is designed to deal with the challenges of climate change. And when I started in government back in 1993, and you know, it was pretty soon after that the government, the then New South Wales government was leaning in to deal with issues that were starting to emerge around climate change. And my team's actually pulled together this really good slide that gives you a bit of a history. And the thing that I would say about this is that what really jumps out to me is that New South Wales really has been at the forefront of climate change policy for a very long period of time. And, we've obviously been aware of the climate wars that have gone on at the federal level, in particular in Australia. But, New South Wales has quietly been doing a lot in this space for a very, very long time. So, as far back as 1998, the Neighbours scheme was established. For those that don't know, it's a scheme that provides star ratings around for commercial buildings and other buildings around their energy efficiency, and with a view to sort of driving improved energy efficiency, which also has a knock-on benefit in terms of reduced emissions. We had effectively an emissions trading scheme, and it was a little bit different as far back as 2002 with the G-Gas scheme, which was effectively required energy companies to acquit a certain number of certificates that drove energy efficiency, and that morphed into the energy security scheme in 2009. And that scheme, along with Neighbours, has delivered a phenomenal amount of emissions reduction over an extended period of time. I think I saw some stats that said, they delivered the equivalent of the emissions that come from the transport sector currently in terms of reduced emissions, which is really quite extraordinary. We got the Climate Change Fund in 2007, which is a very small impost on bills, but it's given us a funding source that's enabled us to develop programs and that help us respond to climate change. And we'll talk about some of those programs in a little while. I don't think a lot of people are aware of this, but New South Wales first committed to net zero emissions by 2050 in 2016 under the former coalition government. And that sort of probably leads to the second point that I want to make. And certainly since, around 2016 and through the early 2020s, there's actually been a really high degree of bipartisan support in New South Wales for action on climate change. And I'll just sort of highlight some of the work in that space. So I mentioned the original, commitment to net zero in 2016. The former coalition government also really took the lead with the electricity infrastructure roadmap in 2020, which is, a comprehensive plan to decarbonise the energy sector or the electricity sector. I'll talk a bit more about that at the moment. But they also came up with the net zero plan, which is, I'll talk about that as well, which is designed to guide emissions reduction across all sectors from 2020 through to 2030. That was done in an environment of really strong bipartisanship. More recently, the current government has sort of taken that to the next level with the Climate Change Net Zero Future Act 2023, which actually provides a legislative framework for which emissions reduction and adaptation can progress. And again, that legislation passed with bipartisan support, and in fact, support from nearly the whole the whole of the parliament. I think there were some outliers there as well. But it's really quite extraordinary when you think about the inaction that's happened at the federal level over an extended period of time until quite recently. And it's, that combination of New South Wales actually leading in this space, plus also the bipartisanship that I think has got us really well placed. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about the Climate Change Net Zero Future Act. It's quite a significant reform that was introduced in 2023. And not only does it provide a legislative framework in which we should progress emission reduction, but it also, and climate change adaptation, But what it also does is it makes it really clear that this is a whole of government responsibility. So what the Act says is that the Premier and, who reflects whole of government accountability, and the Minister for Climate Change are responsible for us delivering on the net zero targets. And it's legislated 3 targets at this point. So a 50% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, a 70% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2035, and then net zero by 2050. So really quite ambitious. I think many of you would be aware that the Commonwealth has just put out its 2035 target. It's gone for a range from 62% to 70%. So you can really see how ambitious that New South Wales Act is. There's also the capacity to set other targets for 2040 and 2045. The other thing I would call out is that it sets a set of principles out which is intended to guide government action, and it makes the government responsible for taking urgent action to respond to climate change, but also requires government to consider a set of principles. And I won't run through them all, and you can have a look at the Act to see what they are. But it's things like there is a critical need to take urgent action to tackle climate change. We need to do that as early as possible. It requires government to consider ecologically sustainable development, requires government to use the best available science, to draw on knowledge of Aboriginal communities, but also rural and regional communities. So it's a really comprehensive framework. And the important point I think to make here is that, by making the Premier accountable, it really sends that signal that this is a whole of government challenge. And certainly what we recognise is that if we're going to hit those emissions reductions targets, we're going to have to work with every department across government to help do that. And I'll talk a bit about how we're going to be doing that through the Net Zero refresh plan. I just mentioned as well, it also puts in place an adaptation objective for government, which that we have to take action to help the community adapt to climate change. It is a reality that, we're already hitting 1.5 degree increase in temperature above pre-industrial levels. That will take hundreds of years to reverse. So the reality is that we are going to have to adapt to the effects of climate change. And I'm sure many people would acknowledge that we're seeing signs of that through, the severity of bushfires, not only here, but overseas, but also the, changes in temperature, more hot days, more humid days. So that adaptation objective is really important. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. We've got policies in place around that, but there's a lot more work to be done in that space as well. The other important part about this legislation is what it does is it sets up a net zero commission. And the purpose of that commission is to really hold the government to account for delivering on both the targets and the adaptation objective. And it consists of 7 commissioners. It's chaired by a gentleman called Nick Rowley, who's just been appointed. Hugh Durrant-White, the chief scientist, is on there as well, and there's 6 other commissioners. They're independent, although the staff are employed in my department. They operate independently of the department. It reports directly to Parliament. Part of its job is to do an annual report, which assesses how we're tracking against those targets and the adaptation objective. That report, the timing of that report is the subject of some changes at the moment. But that will be an annual report. And the idea behind that is that if government isn't on track, the Commission will give that advice and hopefully prompt government into taking further action. So that's a really key part of the architecture and the infrastructure that we've got to make sure we stay on track. The other thing that I would sort of highlight around the current policy architecture for delivering on the net zero objectives and adaptation objectives is the climate change network. So reflecting the fact that the Act makes this a whole of government challenge, the government has set up the Climate Change Network, which is a group of every department across government, plus a few other agencies, of deputy secretaries who are really focused on delivering on the objectives of the Net Zero Act through a coordinated whole of government approach. So what that network does is that it provides the authorising environment to drive policy development and implementation in line with the objectives of the Act. It's looking at, all government policies and programs and governance at a sector level. It's identifying opportunities, particularly evidence-based opportunities that we can take to deliver longer-term reform. And it's also driving that regular engagement and collaboration across government. I'll talk a bit about the net zero refresh that we're doing at the moment, but this group, the Climate Change Network, is playing a really critical role in driving the development of that strategy and ensuring that we've got a genuine whole of government approach to tackling, what is one of the most significant challenges facing the community at the moment. Before I talk about the net zero refresh, I just quickly wanted to talk about the electricity infrastructure roadmap. If we're going to get to net zero, and particularly the 2030 and the 2035 targets, the electricity sector has to do the heavy lifting. And the former government developed the electricity infrastructure roadmap, which is a comprehensive plan to do that. Again, strong bipartisan support. It's backed by legislation. And what the Act does is it sets targets for renewable energy that we need to deliver by 2030 and in some cases by 2034. So the targets are that we need to deliver 12 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 and then 2 gigawatts of firmed or long duration storage, I should say, by firmed capacity by 2030 as well. The core strategy for doing that is the renewable energy zones. So there's 5 of those across the state. And you need to sort of think about these as modern day power stations. Basically, some of these renewable energy zones will deliver more power than what is delivered by the largest renewable energy zones that we have in place. Some of these renewable energy zones will deliver more energy than the largest power stations that we currently have in the grid at the moment. So, it's been, I wouldn't say it's a slow start, but there's been a lot of work needed to be done to get us to this point. But construction is now underway in southwest and central West Orana. They're going to deliver between them sort of nearly 8 or 9 gigawatts of energy. We're in the market for New England to get a delivery partner for that at the moment. We have a delivery partner for Hunter Central Coast, and that construction on that one should get underway pretty soon. And also Illawarra is going to be quite a different res. It'll be an urban res that looks to harness, rooftop solar and batteries on commercial and household roofs to deliver renewable energy as well. So it's really started to get a lot of momentum in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. I'd just also sort of highlight in relation to the roadmap, it's not just about the reses. Behind this is a whole lot of supporting policy architecture. So, we've set those clear legislated targets, which I mentioned. And, that's really important because what happens is we as the department monitor how we're tracking against those targets. And if we don't think we're going to get enough of that energy in time, we the minister asked the consumer trustee to run tenders to underwrite new generation. So we have some specific underwriting agreements called LTESs, long-term energy supply agreements. Sorry, I've got a typo there. And they underwrite solar, wind, firming such as batteries, and also long duration storage as well, such as pumped hydro. And as we kind of constantly monitor what's going on, if we think we're going to need more generation to hit those targets, plus also to keep the lights on, we ask the minister asks the consumer trustee to run more targets. The other thing we do is we provide the market or generators with certainty. So we issue access, or Energy Co issues access rights which are granted to generators, and that guarantees them that they won't be curtailed. So at the moment, one of the issues with the grid is that if there's too much generation going in to a particular area of the grid, the market operator can sort of stop that generation from occurring. What these renewable energy zones do is actually guarantee that the projects that we give the access rights to will continually be able to supply energy into the system. So that's really important to give the market the certainty that it needs. The flip side of that is the ones that we give that privileged right to have to contribute to a community benefit fund. And it's in Central West Orana alone, I think it's about $128 million. Those funds are then distributed back to the community, the communities in the renewable energy zones that are carrying the burden of these projects and the impacts that will have. So that's a really important part of the scheme. The generators that have the access rights have to pay into the fund over an extended period based on how much energy they generate. As well as that, we have a renewable energy sector board that develops local content and local job requirements. Those are actually built into our underwriting and access contracts. As well as that, we have extensive measures to support First Nations. That includes a set of First Nations guidelines that sort of specify how to engage with First Nations communities, but more recently as well, we've done special grants programs to provide specific grants out of the Community Benefit Fund to support First Nations. And where we want to get to with that is hopefully First Nations communities really being able to share in the economic upside of the energy transition. So I'll talk now about the net zero plan. And on the slide there, I've got the new net zero plan to 2035. I'll start with a bit of background with the current plan. So this was developed in 2020 by the former government. And really, it is the first comprehensive plan we had in New South Wales that looked to tackle emissions across all industries. And it was the foundational piece of work that has set us on the path to be able to deliver on net zero emissions by 2050. There's 4 sort of key pillars to that strategy, which you can see on the left there. But what it's trying to do is drive the uptake of proven emissions. It's trying to empower consumers and businesses to make better choices. It's encouraging investment in the next wave of emissions reduction innovation. Some industries, the technology is available to reduce emissions now. For others, it's still some time off. So what we've tried to do is facilitate the investment that's needed to find the solutions for those hard to abate industries. And then finally, ensuring that the New South Wales government leads by example. So it's very much been an adaptive approach. So whilst that plan was released in 2020, there's been a couple of implementation updates in recent years, sort of 2021 and 2022 as well. And we're constantly sort of monitoring that and we'll make the tweaks as we need to. Now, that probably leads to the next key point. So we do annual emissions reductions modelling, which shows how we're tracking against the targets. And our most recent modelling and modelling for the last sort of 1 or 2 years has shown that we're not on track to hit those targets that are set in the Net Zero Futures Act. So from memory, I think we're at about 46% for the 2030 target and 62% for the 2035 target against a target of 70%. The Net Zero Commission, in its first report last year, confirmed that we're not on track to hit those targets and made some recommendations to government about the sorts of areas that it should focus on. If you look at the slide that's there at the moment, you'll kind of see where we're actually at in terms of getting to that 2035 target. So the heavy lifting is very much being done by electricity and energy. And the task for us as DQ and Energy Co is to really make sure we're on track, delivering the rollout of renewable energy. That gets us a big chunk of the emissions reductions we need. Our existing policies under the Net Zero plan get us the next 10 megatons of CO2. But then we've still got a gap of about 20 megatons that we need to get in order to get to the 2035 target. So as a result of that, in responding to the Net Zero plan, in responding to the Net Zero Commission's first report, the government's committed to doing a new Net Zero plan, which will take us through to 2035. And as I mentioned before, the development of that is being overseen by the Climate Change Network. And it really is going to be quite a significant development in that it will take a real, genuine whole of government approach to delivering on those targets. So what will that look like? So we're working towards finalising the new Net Zero plan for 2035 in about April next year. It will contain a number of flagship actions that will put us on the pathway to closing the 20 megaton gap that we have. As well as that, it's going to put in place a framework for developing sector plans. And, the different sectors are able to contribute at different rates. But what the plan will do is start to map out, and the sector plans will start to map out how each sector will support us getting to the 2035 targets and also beyond. So there'll be 8 sector plans, transport, energy, which, we've already got good plans in transport, primary industries, the built environment, resources. Now, priority will be given to developing 3 sector plans first. So they're the ones where we think the technology is the best or there's the biggest opportunity to get reductions in the short term. So those 3 is transport, primary industries, and also the built sector. We'll then build out the rest of the plans after that. We're working in a devolved model. So the idea will be very much that ministers with responsibility for those sectors will lead the development of those plans. We're currently working up how that framework will work at the moment, but it's very much going to be a partnership approach, and it will work under the auspices of that Climate Change Network. This last slide, I just put that up there because I think what we're very much, with this new plan, we're very much taking an approach that we need to think about all of the levers that government has in responding to the challenge. Certainly, I think in the past, government, I think, has been seen as the one that will drive all of this. Government can't do everything, and we've got to be very clear about what the role of government is. So we've given a lot of thought to that, and you'll see that on the screen. But certainly what government can do is set clear direction and provide policy clarity, and I think we've got that in New South Wales. We can look at using regulatory levers, which is something we've not really done before. but think about how we can use regulation to raise the bar on emissions reduction. The Commonwealth obviously has the safeguard mechanism, which is doing that to some extent. But the question we're grappling with at the moment is there more we can do? Government can coordinate action, by collaboration between government, but also looking at markets to see where it can help close supply and demand gaps, can de-risk investment, and that's very much what we're doing in the energy sector, as I alluded to before. Importantly, we can lead by example, and government has given a commitment that government agencies will need to reduce emissions in line with the targets. Lastly, government, I think, has got a big role in ensuring equity and ensuring that the transition benefits everyone and that no one is left behind. So that's a quick run through of the policy architecture that we've got in place around climate change and emissions reduction. Probably the one point I didn't make that I would make, particularly in relation to the electricity sector, is that as well as reducing emissions, the really big challenge for us and for government is there's a really big challenge in keeping the lights on. We have a fleet of very old coal-fired generators on which we're heavily dependent at the moment. I think we're at about 40% renewables in the system now. But those coal-fired generators are not going to be replaced by more coal. And the big challenge, certainly in the short term, is keeping the lights on and keeping the grid stable as well. So that's a big driver for what we're doing as well. Before we open to questions, I just thought I'd highlight a couple of points I think that is really important that underpins good policy development. So I'd probably sort of open this by just sort of saying that I think, over my time in the public sector, policy has, until quite recently, probably been not as valued as highly as it could be, and it's sort of devalued over time. But that said, I think there's a huge opportunity at the moment as, this government in particular, and it's happening at the federal level as well, and I think in other jurisdictions, trying to reduce this over-reliance on consultants and really rebuild the policy capability within government. And to me, that's a really significant change because I do think policy has sort of been left to atrophy a bit over a long period. And so the opportunity for us is to really think about our policy capability and how we can do policy well. I've got a couple of sort of observations on that in terms of things that I think are important. So one is, I think we need to be very mindful of our role as public servants and what our role is in relation to supporting government and how we execute that through policy. And I think one of the mistakes that often gets made is, we're charged with providing, frank and fearless and independent advice to government. And, that's the core of public service and particularly policy advice. But I think the mistake that sometimes gets made is that people lose sight of the fact that our role is to actually work with the government of the day and support them to deliver their agenda and give them the frank and fearless advice they need so they can do what they are elected to do. And that's quite different from a more abstract notion of giving advice as to, delivering on what a particular industry might want or a perceived objective view of what's in the best interest of the environment. So I think it's important that we remember that distinction, that we serve the public interest by helping the government deliver what it was elected to do. And whilst that doesn't mean we're party political, but it does mean that we need to be small p, politically astute and aligned with what government is trying to do and not pursuing a broader agenda which isn't aligned with what they're elected to do. My other sort of comment on policy that I would flag is I think in government we've had a bit of a tendency to perhaps over-engineer things a bit. And in many ways, in giving policy advice, we want a degree of certainty around the management of risk. And we work in an environment that is often very risk averse, and what that often drives is a focus on trying to eliminate all risk. And I think a lot of the time we get to the answer where we've solved 80 to 90% of the policy problem that we're that we're trying to resolve. But we then spend an inordinate amount of time trying to remove the last 10 to 20% of risk. And I think one of the really key things for policy success is knowing when to call it, when you've got enough certainty. And that's not 100%, that's somewhere between 80 and 90%, that you give your advice and you think about how you will adapt the strategy that you've come up with to respond to any unexpected challenges. So I think that's really important to sort of focus on sort of what I describe as not over-egging things. But that's something I've always tried to keep in mind with the policy work that I've done. The other one that I would sort of emphasize is I think we've tended to have a very big emphasis on the grand strategy. And in many ways, the net zero plan that I've sort of focused on before is example of one of those big strategies. And MCT, Michael Kootstrotter, once described one strategy that I'd been involved in developing as the longest bureaucratic suicide note in history. Now, what I think is important from that is I think you do need those big plans and you need those big strategies, but you also need to have a focus on two things. One is adapting those strategies, or making sure that those strategies are adaptive so that you can tweak them and refine them as you go along. And you'll see that's what the former government did with the implementation reviews of the 2020 net zero plan. So I think having that adaptive framework is really important from a policy design point of view. The other thing that I would say is you can spend a lot of time developing that grand strategy, that big strategy, but at the same time, I'm a big advocate for actually getting on the ground and doing some smaller stuff so that you can learn from it, so that the ultimate strategy that you develop is much more effective. And there's that old adage about start small, fail small, but learn from it. I think that's really important, and actually sort of getting the balance right between that big strategy and those smaller, more targeted pilot type approaches, I think is really, really important. Lastly, the one thing I'd call out is the importance of the focus on implementation. I did a lot of policy work in my early days in the Cabinet Office, and it was in the legal branch there. And there was always rumoured that that legal branch was set up because a former Premier could never get the Attorney General's department to do what they wanted. Now, I don't know if that's true. It's probably urban myth, but we often stepped in and developed policy across any, government department in government, which responded to sort of political imperatives. But looking back on that now, I would say one of the things we didn't do well was think about the implementation task. And, if policy is going to be effective, it needs to work hand in glove with implementation. And, you need to involve the people that are going to have to implement stuff in the policy development. But I think as well, it's also important to, focus on those smaller projects or pilots that you can do that actually test things so you know what you're proposing will actually work. So there's just a couple of things that I thought I'd reflect on. I might stop sharing my screen now and throw it open for questions.
Yes, thank you. That's great. We do have some questions for you, and I'm just coordinating for those of you joining us for the first time. As per usual, we'll be working in the chat. So if you can write your question into the chat, and then I'll coordinate the order. And don't forget to turn your camera on and your mic on, and introduce yourself, which agency you're from, before asking your question. So our first question is from Nicole on data centres.
Thanks, Louisa. Thanks, Anthony, for a great presentation. And my question is actually quite specific around data centres that I understand are being increasingly constructed and are quite power sort of hungry in terms of energy, the energy demands, as well as water. Through some recent studies I got to visit a construction site, and it was clear that the backup power source for this vast data centre is diesel, and the construction company, one of the large providers, wasn't required to recycle water that was produced, so it's just going to get pumped into the local sort of system. I'm just wondering, in terms, I noticed you mentioned the build sector is one of the kind of first cabs off the rank. How will New South Wales government be ensuring that as we sort of increase our use of AI and more of these centres are built, that they're not kind of jeopardising our ability to meet the net zero targets? Is that something that planning would consider in the sector plan?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really an issue that is front and centre, not only for my department but for right across government. I think government is very much focused on the economic opportunity that comes with data centres, and a lot of the time that gets dismissed on the basis that once you get past construction, there's not many jobs there. But the data centre industry actually generates, I think, a lot of jobs in downstream from it, in things like AI and IT and all of that sort of stuff. So it's a big opportunity, but when you look around the world, you can see where it's gone sort of horribly wrong. And Ireland and Singapore have actually had to sort of put the brakes on new data centres going in there. It is something that government is thinking about very much at the moment, and about trying to get that balance right between the two. I'm certainly very strongly of the view that we want to bring those data centres to New South Wales because of the economic opportunity, but equally we want to set the terms on which that happens as well. And if every data centre that gets built in Western Sydney has a diesel generator, if power goes out and they all go on at once, that's going to be a really significant issue. So these issues are being identified at the moment, and government is thinking through from a policy point of view, kind of what are the terms that we want to set in relation to this. The issue for my department in particular is there's a lot of I think a lot of people think, we've got boundless renewable energy that's going to be available for these data centres. And certainly it's factored into the planning that's done about whether there's enough capacity there at the moment with what's coming. But we have to be very thoughtful about where the data centres are located as well. So that's something we're very focused on. And you mentioned the water one as well. I mean, that's a massive challenge, particularly in Sydney, where, there's a real there's issues emerging around the supply-demand balance as well. But the short answer, I think, to your question is government is alive to it, and I think is very much thinking about it with a clear mind to think about what is it that we want to get out of this, and how do we mitigate the risk to the community and the economy in New South Wales. Yeah.
Thanks, Anthony.
Our next question, Shirley, would you like to come on and ask a question on Scope 3?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Anthony. Lovely to see you. I'm in the Strategic Policy and Cabinet branch at DQ. I was just hoping to hear more about how the New South Wales government is addressing Scope 3 emissions that are coming from the state. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the focus of the plan, the net zero plan at the moment, is very much on Scope 1 and Scope 2. Scope 3 emissions is far more complex for New South Wales to deal with as a jurisdiction. There have been recent decisions of the Land and Environment Court that have raised sort of the bar to some extent in terms of how those issues are dealt with through the planning system. One of the things that the government is thinking about at the moment is the coal industry, and there is work underway that's looking at it's effectively a statement around coal and what role the industry plays going forward, and that will inevitably have to deal with the Scope 3 issue as well. But at the moment, it's being dealt with through the planning system to some extent, and then I think with industries like coal, where it's export, etc., that's where the Scope 3 stuff will start to get dealt with through some of those sector plans. Yeah. The one other thing I'd mention, though, is in terms of committing government agencies to deliver on the targets as well through their own operations, there is a requirement for government agencies to think about their Scope 3 emissions, and by 2028 they have to start thinking about that and start to think about how they can reduce those as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, we have, sorry to put you on the spot, Nanda Kumar, but would you mind coming on and asking your question? I know, I don't think you're from DQ, and this is a whole of government webinar, so I thought you might come on and ask your question about community safety of installation of batteries.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. So, Mike, you were spot on when you said about the strategy versus implementation. I'm a great supporter of what you have said, having worked in transport for the last 30 years and hands-on in many projects and trials. There is this perception in the community that, they have put the panels, but they don't want to accept the batteries because of this not being safe. And then again, the economics of it, by the time you go and install and replace, you go to replace the panels, and at the moment they give subsidy, but will it be sustainable in the long run? And basically safety of this battery system at homes, that is precluding people from taking decisions. Although there are people out there who are chasing, so what is the government doing about this? This is the implementation problem that you talked about. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's a really good question. So a couple of things on batteries and the safety question. So we have had a program where we were incentivising batteries, and the Commonwealth has come in over the top and has the I think it's called the Better Home Batteries program. And it's been going since 1 July. It's providing a significant financial incentive for people to install batteries, and people are voting with their feet, or with their wallets, probably a better way to put it. So the number of batteries that's been installed under that scheme since 1 July is really significant. I think the last numbers I saw was something like 30 or 40,000 have been installed in that period. Could be wrong on that, but in rolling out that program and in our previous program, we've very much been working with the Commonwealth and also with the regulators in New South Wales, which is the Building Commission and IPART, to make sure that we've got to provide confidence effectively that those batteries are being installed correctly to minimise any risk. It's a good point, though. I wonder whether we could do a broader education campaign around that to sort of explain some of the issues or non-issues. It's probably better to put it with the safety of batteries as well. But we are certainly working with the regulator, and in fact, government's provided resources to the Building Commission to support them to give them additional capacity to do the inspections that are needed. It's not just the community. Fire and rescue has concerns around the EV charging in apartment buildings. We're confident that the research shows that there is not a significant issue with that. We're working with fire and rescue to try and encourage them to take a more forward-leaning approach towards the installation of EV chargers, which are perceived to have risks similar to batteries. Yeah. Do you want me to answer the seed one as well?
No, I'm actually going to go to a question from Larissa next, because she wanted to ask about implementation, which I think follows on from that question. Larissa.
Yep. Thanks, Louisa, for trying to make all the questions flow. So Anthony, you mentioned that sometimes we over-engineer and we try to get everything right in the policy and the program launch and that, and it can take so long that we perhaps don't take the best advantage, and there are other ways of doing things. Could I get you to speak a bit more to that? Is it about policies? Is it about government? Is it about the way that we do things, our governance, our risk perspectives? What do we do as civil servants to try and promote that sort of earlier uptake and get things moving?
Yeah, I think I think we do operate in a very risk-averse environment, and that tends to sort of create a bit of a mindset that we need to lock absolutely everything down. And it's just not possible, and you can spend a lot of time doing that. So I think what certainly is what leaders in the public sector need to do is create the environment where there is an acceptance of risk and a tolerance for making mistakes, or educated mistakes, if I can put it that way, and from learning from those. So I think that's really important. But I think it's sort of, getting to a point where you've got enough confidence to be able to give the policy advice that you need around the majority of the issues, but being transparent around where there might still be some residual risks, and having some clear strategies for how you will mitigate those risks as well, or not necessarily mitigate them, but monitor them, because they're effectively unknowns. You're not quite sure whether they're going to materialise, but if they do, you want to be able to respond rapidly. So maybe not working out the ultimate answer to that question about how do you mitigate that risk, but thinking about if it does actually materialise, how you would deal with that. Yeah. Did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, want to see what we can do to support that kind of approach. That's great. Thank you.
I think it's really important. The point I made about leadership and really creating that environment is absolutely critical.
Another big question we have, Claudine. I think you'll come on. Hi, Claudine. How are you going?
Good, thanks, Louisa. Anthony, I'm Claudine Mutu. I lead the social science team in Science and Insights. My question is, what might the net zero sector plan look like for the nature sector? I noticed your slide had a picture of a tree, which I think was representing the nature sector. Yeah,
look, I haven't talked about this today, but the government last year released the Plan for Nature, and as part of that, one of the core commitments is to develop a nature strategy, and that work is sort of underway at the moment. So there won't sort of be a nature sector plan under the climate change framework, but the nature strategy will map out how the government is going to put nature on the path to recovery. One of the really important elements of the Plan for Nature is the need to sort of take complementary action around responding to climate change, but also nature at the same time. That's a really important principle. So the detail of that will get fleshed out through the nature strategy. We're thinking it's going to take, a similar sort of approach. We're thinking about what legislative support we need for a nature strategy at the moment. We're actually consulting with stakeholders. And we kind of envisage that we'll have a similar sort of architecture where we set long-term targets and then have a plan that helps guide the investment to deliver on those targets over time as well.
Thanks. And speaking of guiding investment, Danielle has a question on making that a reality. Danielle, would you like to come on?
Hi, Anthony. My name is Danielle Frost. I work in primary industry productivity and abatement in DQ. And my question is about the supply of native seed, because last year Ken Henry made the point that revegetation-based abatement is going to be having to do some of the lifting, and it's going to be having to do it well. You can't do that well without a solid supply of native seed on the shelf, which is currently not on the shelf and not managed especially well in New South Wales. So my question is, what is the New South Wales government going to do about having a good genetically traced supply of native seed for veg-based abatement? And a little bit in relation with the res as well. Like, can we make sure that native seed is always harvested before the rollout of a res, and whether we could use res land as seed production area?
That's a really, really good question. And that particular issue about the availability of seed to do revegetation has sort of been flagged with me by a number of groups that are looking to do revegetation. That's an issue that we'll pick up in the nature strategy. Your suggestion around there's a lot of clearing that's happening for the reses, which is unfortunate. But thinking about whether there's an opportunity to collect seed from that as well, I think is a good one. So I'll pass that one on to people. I think the other thing we need to have a look at as well is some of the legislative restrictions that are in place around the collection of seed, which perhaps provide a bit of a barrier to that. Is there a need to perhaps make those a bit more flexible so we can actually get the seed that we need to do the revegetation, to sort of provide abatement, but also do revegetation to put nature on a path to recovery? So don't have the answers to that, but it's something that will get looked at in the nature strategy.
Yeah, my question is also highlighted seed production areas. So if there's land that can be used for that, I think maybe the state should have that in place.
Yeah,
if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good comment. I'll put you in touch with someone from my team who's thinking very closely along those lines as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Louisa.
And Anthony, we're nearly at time, but I had one more question for you. And you have to kind of touched on the Commonwealth or Australian government is doing work on climate change as well as the state, and the state has played a really critical role, I guess, in developing climate change policy that will work for Australia. But what do you see the role of the Australian government versus the role of the states in this space?
Yeah, another good question. What's really good at the moment is, after an extended period of policy uncertainty, we have the Commonwealth playing a very active role. I think what they can bring that the state is far more limited in bringing is funding. They have a number of very big programs that we need to get better at drawing on to help our hard-to-abate industries decarbonise. So I think that funding is really, really important. I think as well they play a really critical role in providing national policy and regulatory frameworks that will help us deliver on the net zero objectives. The obvious one is around the framework that's in place for ACCUs or carbon offsets, so that they've got integrity and credibility. It's much better that stuff is done on a national level than on a state-by-state level. They're playing in that space as well in relation to the nature repair market as well. So And as well as that, I think they play that really important role in terms of regulating industry nationally, particularly where they operate in export markets. They can actually think about the broader impacts on the national economy and pull levers in that space, which I don't think the state necessarily has the capacity to do because of legal or other restrictions as well. But the big one, without a doubt, is the big bucket of cash. So.
Thank you very much. We're on time. I wanted to thank you for sharing climate change policy with us, and apologies for our members that it took us 6 years to get to this really important topic, but thank you for covering it so well. And I wanted to thank our audience for their interest and enthusiasm in policy too. So we'll be joined in the next few months by, we're hoping to do a feature on the IPA's policy hack, and I also have a introduction to policy webinar to run for you as well, which will be great. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, and see you again next time. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.